All right, everyone, welcome. You are here for the SHAPE workshop, leading your peers. We find ourselves in situations oftentimes where maybe we are around the same age, around the same position level, around the same volunteering, whatever that might be. Sometimes we are in a situation where we need to lead our peers. And so we found this to be an important topic to discuss in our mini certificate, specifically around the management and supervision one. So my name is Emily. My pronouns are she and hers, and I'm really glad to be here with you today. So thanks for those who are joining us. Now, I think everyone's connected to audio. And we'll welcome folks as they come. If you are watching the recording sometime in the future, how is the future? Just kidding. You can't tell us. All right, let's start. Um, So this is one of the last workshops in the mini certificates. Again, it's in the management and supervision. If some of you are like, I have not heard of this before, stick around at the end and we will talk about it, or email emily.ambrose@colostate.edu and I'll tell you all about it. But for those of you who have been on this journey, we are just about done, which is very exciting. I'm glad that we can be here. So today, again, we're going to be scratching the surface. I think leading your peers, it can be something that's so important to talk through situations and scenarios. So my hope in scratching the surface is that we plant some seeds, hence the growth theme of the PowerPoint, that we plant some seeds in what you could do in situations or scenarios where you find yourself really wanting to inspire action or encourage or cultivate buy-in, and how we do that together. The things that we're going to talk about today are really going to hopefully lead towards that. We are going to talk a little bit about the concept of power. We're going to then really finalize the day with some tips and tricks and talk about how important support is for you as well as your team. Oftentimes people in this workshop act as what we call middle managers. I think it's Simon Sinek who talks about middle management being one of the toughest places to be because it tends to just be this bridge between that you're not actually doing the work that you love or making the actual decisions that make change, but you're kind of this in between space. I don't know if you all feel that. Sometimes I feel that. And so that can be kind of a challenging space to be. So tips and tricks and how important cultivating support for yourself and your team is. And then we'll leave with some takeaways. So that's where we're going today. So first and foremost, we have power over and power with. So let's talk a little bit about the concept of power. First of all, I want you to put in the chat, when I say the word power, what comes to mind? What do you think about when I say the word power in an interpersonal concept? Mm-hmm, 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 mm-hmm. Yasmin, welcome. We're talking a little bit about power. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing some themes around authority, control, maybe the ability and agency to make decision. When you look it up in an interpersonal context, in the dictionary, it really talks about the ability to influence, to shift behavior, attitudes, or perceptions. So that's power in an intercultural or an interpersonal concept, right? There can be positional power that's very overt in the leadership structure, right? If we're in a defined hierarchy, we have rungs of ladders and it's kind of spelled out for us on an organizational chart. And then you can think of maybe a family. You can think of just a group of friends. And you also can kind of sense who has more power in that. We call that informal power, right? So what are the things that that lead folks towards having more sway, more influence? There's a variety of different ones. I'd really love to do a whole workshop just on power. I think that will be to come. But for this, it is important in talking about leading your peers to identify and be able to assess this concept of power. Hi, Rebecca, welcome. When we're talking about power in this traditional sense, and you're talking about leading your peers, it can sometimes feel like you don't maybe have a lot of power over. So we're going to talk about the concept of power with. How do we share that power and cultivate it in a way that people really do want to buy into it, feel cared for, and so we can move forward in progress. So when you're thinking about some of the other workshops of building the power team, this is going to be a lot of the sense of teamwork as well. So what really cultivates that teamwork with power? So Dr. Brene Brown has done decades of research specifically around leadership. She's expanded out and does, she's really known for vulnerability and shame. She's all over the place, kind of. But her more recent really focus has been around leadership, specifically from a book called Dare to Lead, which is fantastic, and talks about the concept of power over. We're only going to, you can read some of these, but we're going to talk about 5 of them or so. So power over, right? I'm going to use a hand gesture, a hand motion here, right? This is that concept of being in a position over someone, and the belief that power is finite, and the use of fear to protect and hoard power. Okay, I feel like I hear a lot of this within the concept of the Russia-Ukraine war currently, right? So the use of fear, the being over, that authoritarian, leveraging fear to divide, destabilize, and devalue decency. And you might be like, wow, you just used an international example. How does that relate to my organization? As we're talking through it, we can sense sometimes when we have experienced leaders who give people experiencing fear and uncertainty, or a sense of false certitude and safety based on ideology and nostalgia over facts. So sometimes we go this, and maybe it's anecdotal things or stories that are told for scare tactics to kind of keep and maintain that control over what's happening. So like when change is coming, say in a university or institution, this fear of don't step out of line, we could be dismembered as a organization, or everything will crumble and we'll all lose our jobs. Whether that's in fact or not, that can be an example of power over. This is really important. The being right is more important than getting it right. So again, when we look at power over, I'm going to jump around a little bit. They maintain power by demonstrating an ever-increasing capacity, sometimes for cruelty, including shaming and bullying, especially towards vulnerable populations. I just listened to a Hidden Brain podcast about kind of this use of bullying tactics, or like undercuts, or just rudeness to kind of keep people in line. And I think this happens a lot more than maybe I even want to believe. Just some of those offhanded side comments, or in the meeting, that's like just encourages people to kind of keep in line and fall in line. This can be demonstrated of, I would say, sometimes insecure, but this desire to keep this power over and to keep this control and authority, which is what was said came to mind in some of the concepts around power. Give people someone to blame for their discomfort, preferably someone who looks, acts, and sounds different than they do. I think we could get into, there's a lot that we could get into. Just curious, find those reaction buttons or your hands. Any of this sound familiar, either from what you've heard in the media or in teams that you've been part of, or like supervisors that we might have had? Like, I know when I was starting off in retail, I not to give retail a bad name. We all need, folks in retail, but there were some instances that I could really see this. Yeah, I'm seeing that. Okay. Me too, Debbie. Me too. I was just looking at your chat. Okay, so now we get to this concept that really comprises leading your peers, right? So when we're with people in a group setting, how do we access power, right? The ability to influence action, to believe that power becomes infinite and expands when shared with others. So there's not so much of this power hoardingness of it. There is this understanding that we can all have a voice, and it might come down to decision makers, or there might be a time sensitivity of things, but there is more trust that's cultivated because there's not this feeling of power hoarding. You can leverage connection and empathy to unite and stabilize. And there's a value around decency as a function of self-respect and respect for others. They offer people experiencing fear and uncertainty transparency, and create learning cultures based on critical thinking and evidence-based data from multiple perspectives. So I really felt this when, now as we're emerging, maybe hopefully from pandemic towards endemic, of these past couple of years, knowing this is April of 2022 and March of 2020 was when at least the US was really experiencing it. in a high way. The leading towards what is the evidence-based data? How are we being transparent, even if we're not quite sure? How are we like having power with, even I think the university trying to really be forthcoming with some of the, pandemic preparedness team and all of the ways that they were informed around it. Um, Creating learning cultures based on critical thinking. I think that hopefully really embodies institutions of higher education, of which we are all a part. Whether or not our departments model this is different, right? I think we can know what is proposed in the classrooms to the students, and then in real life, what kind of happens is not always critical thinking and learning cultures. But that's what happens when we go to power with. And then here's the crux, right? Getting it right is more important than being right. So there's not so much leaning on stubbornness around it's my way or the highway. I'm not listening to anybody else. Like this is right. It's getting it right. What is the process to move towards getting it right? We can normalize discomfort and move away from shame and blame and toward accountability and meaningful change. We can frame leadership as a responsibility to be in service of others rather than served by others. So this really focuses on the theory of servant leadership. That leading from behind, moving with. So what are the needs of the populace of whom you're working with? So again, if you're finding yourself in middle management, how are you being in service to your employees or in service of the volunteers that you're working with? What can you anticipate them needing? And how can you be in service instead of served by them? Framing rights and freedoms as privileges that are connected to responsibility to the larger community or organizational culture, and then center connection and humanity with empathy-driven agendas, policies, and values. I think this aligns a lot with our principles of community at CSU in terms of integrity, inclusion, respect, service, and social justice. That those principles of community really focus around the humanity, the connection, the connectivity of our RAMS community, and really emulates this concept of power with, in my mind. Aspirational, maybe, not felt by all of us every point of the day, but what we can be working towards and where we have the agency to make change. Okay. Now, I want honesty. I would love, we have 6 folks here. I'd love to put you in pairs and have a little bit of a conversation about this. You also might hate that, and we can have a conversation all together. So give me a thumbs, like a thumb dar, if you're like, yeah, no, that it would be cool to talk to someone from a different department, or like, no, I'd really like to stay in a big group. Thank you. Oh, it's good. Okay. All right. I got some for a big group. We got a middler. Oh, I like it. Okay, some. I'm looking for like, I guess there's there is a thumbs down. Okay. I was wondering if in the reactions they had a thumb down. All right, here's what we're gonna do. So this might be a little bit vulnerable. I'm gonna give you 30 seconds and I want you to look at, I'm gonna put the file. Where I have it. There we go. So I just sent the file in the chat. I want you to open that up. And I want you to, it just popped up now. I think it was like doing something. But I want you to open that up, click on it. And where do you see yourself in this list? Or where have you seen someone else in this list? Just think about that for a while. You don't have to answer the questions. And then what is one opportunity that you could try in your role? What might be an action around some of the power with components that could be pretty easily demonstrated? I'm just going to give you a little bit. I'm also going to find it in a link form if the file isn't downloading for everyone. So give me 1 second. All right. A couple of folks have said I don't see the file in the chat, so I'm giving you a link that will bring you to the list. All right. I'm going to pause the recording and we're going to have a little bit of a conversation here. For those of you watching the recording, I want you to be thinking of those questions that you see on the screen right now. Okay. All right. So hopefully, through some of that reflection, it's important to be able to identify our examples that we've seen in our lives of where we've seen this done well and where we've not done this well, so we can reflect on ourselves and our own self-awareness of where and how we might be able to leverage it, and really how to get feedback in it too. That's a huge part of leading your peers. Okay. So tips and tricks for leading peers. Your role as a leader starts with setting a positive foundation for the team's interactions. Here's one thing that I really appreciate about higher ed, and the context wherever, whether we're working in a dining hall, a biology lab, facilities management, the dance and theater department. There tend to be these ebbs and flows of the seasons, right? We have semesters, we talk in semesters, we talk in summers, all of those pieces. So we have these chapters of the year that when we turn the new page, it's almost like a welcome to a new start, right? I don't know if any of your organizations or departments have this, but we'll have, a beginning of the semester kickoff retreat, which is really just an elongated meeting. Sometimes we try to have some fun at it. But it kind of, right, sets goals, sets tones. We might all have work plans or evaluations that we need to do. But when you're thinking about our roles as leaders, setting a positive foundation for the team's interactions, I think that we have the opportunity to re-up that at the turning of the page of each chapter, right? Or at the new coming in of new staff members. Because anytime, Tuckman's theory of group development would say that a group is different every time someone leaves and someone comes, and vice versa. If you think about that and how many people have been leaving and also coming to CSU, there are new groups all the time. So how do we set the foundation for a team's interactions? Tip 1 is to guide the group process. Now, notice we say guide and not to dictate, authoritate, whatever those other verbs are that leave no room for input or say. Guide the group process. And we do this by creating as much of a relaxed environment. Now, that doesn't need to mean, I think we could deconstruct the word professional all day. It means different things in different areas, in all of that, right? But in a relaxed environment, how do we encourage open communication? How do we encourage that time? Hi, Stephen. Good to see you. And then how also do we ask for input? Do we communicate some of that by opening up the dialogue so it doesn't just begin a monologue? It's not just, man, I'm in some meetings where it's literally just the facilitator or the manager at the meeting just railing off a list of updates, and it literally could have been an email, right? So it's like, how do we encourage and ask and know that if input is given, it will be considered and then incorporated in? I think that's all in trust building as well. Promoting active listening as you guide the group process. And then this is a really important thing that I think is underutilized, but can really benefit you when you might start having issues. And we're in the workshops around conflict management or all of those, right? Group guidelines, which are agreed upon. When we're looking at equity and inclusion, we are hired in with a job description, right? The job description has kind of been written. We might have some deliverables that we need to meet. You've consented to that job and that position by basically being hired in for what's on that job description. So really, that's a bit of an agreement. When you're in a team context, how do you come up with these guidelines that are agreed upon together, that are what we call co-constructed? by all of us. Because then when something happens or people aren't showing up for their shifts or there's conflict within, we can go back to these agreements and say, well, let's come back to some of these things. What has changed or shifted? Where might we need to do a little bit of work? And it brings people back to the higher power, if you will, or the higher purpose of why the group came together in the first place. It can increase some nostalgia also, but really it's this undercurrent of accountability that one person, especially if you are leading your peers, one person cannot dictate the culture of an organization. You can't force a ethos of positivity, but you can really encourage through asking for input, active listening, a relaxed environment, and then coming back to these agreements throughout the time that you're together. And then participative decision making. So remember how at the beginning I asked about like when you think of power, what do you think of? A couple of people said decision making power, like the ability to make decisions. And so when you have participative decision making, what does that look like? And how can you maybe get close to consensus? Maybe it's not full consensus, but how can you really build some of that trust by participating? Again, this is all in the context of leading your peers. Tip number two, empower team members. When you empower, you communicate trust. So when I say empower team members, that might be taking that extra 30 seconds to acknowledge something that's been done really well and be like, are you interested in having a bit more responsibility around that? I really think we could benefit from your input here. Or whether or not they have capacity, maybe that's on a one-on-one, maybe you don't spring that on them, but the belief in others sometimes makes folks believe in themselves. When others see things in us before we might see it in ourselves, it empowers us that they trust us and that we were chosen for a reason, and it really can generate this positive ethos in a teamwork capacity. Be creative with reward and recognition. Hashtag affirm where possible. If you've done the feedback workshop with me, you've remembered the statistics that effective, efficient teams have a 6-to-1 roughly positive to negative feedback, right? So the affirmations, it's like little quick quips, not toxic positivity or like you can't be negative anywhere. You can complain about some things or whatever, but it's that, Stephen, I think you did great on that last design. I'd love to see that again. Or Keith, thanks so much for getting those numbers to me. Like I really couldn't do that without it, or whatever that is. Like it's just that increase, those little quips. 6-to-1 are the highest performing teams. Moderate performing teams, they're still 2-to-1. Two positive comments, feedback pieces to one. And then when we get negative, we get real negative. We get a 20, roughly, like it's like 19.8, a 20-to-1. Like negativity just churns on itself, right? I don't know if you've seen this recently. I feel like there's been some energy in the air. Like there can be different even waves, I think, but it's such a positive. And that's really when you get with low effective teams and not high producing and really when people leave. So if you want to keep your team, if you want to empower them, if you're maybe leading some of your peers, how do you empower and communicate trust? And then how are you creative with reward and recognition? So maybe that's something at the end of the year, but maybe it's something throughout the time. And maybe it's just a post-it note on the desk. It's also tapping into how people like to be rewarded in affirmation. But this, I think, is a really important one. And this is something we could do as easy as tomorrow. You literally could do something small tomorrow and be like, oh, look, I did something from that workshop. What are ways that you can empower employees and team members? So I want to hear from a couple of folks. You can also use the chat because I know some of us are being kind of quiet. What are ways that you either have been or think that you could empower employees and team members based on some of the examples that I gave?
Well, since I'm the chatty one, I'll start. So if you're leading a meeting and the group comes up with some action items, you could ask one of the team members to, draft some thoughts on put together this or that, small document to bring to the next meeting for us to discuss. And it's a small enough scale that it's not super overwhelming, but it does say, I value your opinion. I think you could show leadership here.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And maybe that step farther of like having them facilitate the discussion too, kind of like owning that. Because otherwise, maybe it feels like it just administrative work, but it's really getting their ideas out there and then like facilitating that. I love that, Debbie. That's great. I'm seeing from the chat, let the group decide how something should be done versus supervisor decide alone. I love that, Joni. I think that really demonstrates that decision making, but also the fact that something needs to be done might be a fact, but how it gets done, there is a lot of wiggle room. There are a lot of pathways from A to B. And oftentimes supervisors only think that there's one pathway. And if you didn't do it this pathway, you did it wrong. And that's so untrue. So I really appreciate that. Quick check-ins, say ways to go taking care of that patient today. Oh, way to go, taking care of that patient today. I love that. That's awesome. So those smaller affirmations, being supportive and interested in their passions and helping them get there, showing appreciation and also believing. And I also believe it empowers others. Absolutely. Yasmin, that's great. Yeah, and it can be little things like Debbie, I don't know if you allow your, lab folks to lock up, but that might be like a higher level of responsibility that they can't, right? Like that any of the little things like, can you count your drawer alone? I guess lots of places are going cashless. Who uses cash anymore? But like those little things that aren't extra labor but demonstrate responsibility. I love all the affirmations too. That's great. I like adding some of these in. So this is just what I call a visual break because at this point, especially late in the day, we've been staring at a computer for a long time. So I just want to take 10 seconds, refocus away. I'm not looking at my screen. I'm looking 20 feet in advance. So it's like, whew, it's like refocusing your eyes. I'd sing to you too, but I'm going to spare you. Okay. Y'all, we're almost done. I think we have about 10 more minutes. Tip 3 is to be flexible where possible. Welcome questions and be transparent. So when there is obvious power in groups and decisions are being made all around people, there can be this like shifting plate tectonics, this real uncertainty, this fear of the unknown. So how are you welcoming questions and being transparent to the point where you can be? So I know an upper level administrator, I think like an associate vice president, who works with a staff of about 50, and they have committed to their people. I will never tell you that I don't know something if I do know. I might say, I do know, and I'm not able to share that right now. And I commit that as soon as I'm able to, I will. And I think we have to find ourselves where and how disclosure and transparency, because transparency isn't always necessarily the best way to go. And it also can be very in alignment with equity. So often power is hoarded because of the decisions that are made behind closed doors and the information that's kept and the gatekeeping around all of that. So how can we encourage trust, empowerment, teamwork together by encouraging and welcoming questions and being transparent where possible? Also, be as communicative as possible. I would say that if folks think you're communicating too much, that's probably a sense that you're doing it right, because you're never going to get it just right with anyone, right? It's either going to be too much or too little. You're always complaining about something. People are never happy, right? But being as communicative as possible and upfront when you have the information and you can share it, I think is really important in trust building and leading your peers. There is also this aspect of holding expectations firmly where needed. It does none of us any good if we have expectations that are agreed upon and people are let to slide. I think sometimes we can get into, well, there's probably something going on, at least having a check-in conversation, at least having some feedback, at least encouraging the expansion of awareness of what a decision or a missed something, what that impact is in terms of being felt. So the fact that someone was late to a shift means that that the next person can't get to class on time, or um, the fact that someone's not at staff meeting. And these are hard times, right? There's a lot of mental health pieces going on. There's a lot of extenuating circumstances. And so I would encourage the feedback workshop. I think we have it on the SHAPE YouTube, if you haven't done those pieces before. But holding expectations firmly where needed. I used to think that it was gracious and giving to just kind of let people off the hook. And what I have learned is that, especially when they get to positions that are beyond mine, I'm not doing any favors by not holding accountable around the expectations that we've agreed upon. So maybe that rings true. Tip four, set goals and visions together so that you're going to hear some similarities. So assess agreed values and priorities. You're seeing that consistent of like what's been agreed upon. Learn the why behind the what. Sometimes people are like, man, I don't want to wash this floor or put in this data to this weird Excel sheet or clean this Petri dish one more time or whatever. All of those Petri dishes and Excels and floors are part of a larger why. And when we come back to the why, once in a while, right? Maybe at these bookends or at these chapters, at these page chapters, when we remember our why, it reinvigorates us in a way. I just went to an event called Project Homeless Connect, and it had been offline for a couple of years for somewhat obvious reasons. And it was like, oh my gosh, this is a much more complicated story than we will have time for. But it was this moment of like, this is the why. All of the spreadsheets led to this, all of the van reservations, all of the, complaining in the offices about this not happening with this and blah, blah, blah. But it came together and you could remember the why. Sometimes when we get so in the weeds, we can get really frustrated with the things that are right in front of us. And so bringing it back and remembering the why can be really important to that. And then go through accountability together. Ask them if we've met our hopes and objectives. Ask them if we are doing well by our agreed upon things. So this, again, it kind of is formulaic. Like if you don't set agreements, even within like a new hire one-on-one or those onboarding things, how do we go together? I was actually just awarded a presidential fellowship in the HR department. We're going to be working on performance management. And I think about this a lot in terms of how administrative professionals, that's a classification of employees, are going to do this like series of performance management. I'm looking forward to learning a lot, but I'm guessing it has a lot to do with, with the workshop that we're doing today. All right, and then finally, our fifth tip is to support your team. So we talked about support being really important at the beginning for you and your team. Advocating and getting them what they need. This can be sometimes really low-hanging fruit. I worked with a department who did a feedback survey, and they said it'd be really nice to have a whiteboard in our radio room. That is a $35 fix. We got that the next week. And it's just those little things of like, oh, they heard us. They did it. I feel supported. What are some other things and pieces, right? And being forthcoming when you can advocate and you might not be able to get them what they need, being able to share the why behind it as well. Share feedback openly and through all channels. I think that's upwards and around. And then finally, request and provide feedback frequently. So these open channels of communication, just of like, how are things going? What are you doing? Knowing your scope, right? We can't be people's therapists. We can't be people's best friends all the time. We can't, there's lots of pieces, but having a little bit of knowledge of what's going on, how we can advocate for folks, how we can know the resources in our areas to be able to support one another is really important. So when you're thinking about leading your peers, how do you know the environment around? So you can share some of those resources for support for them. And then all of us can access those resources as well. Sometimes I get so in the weeds that I'm like, oh, I can call employee assistance program just like anybody else. And I have before, right? So advocating for yourself, advocating for your team, and getting feedback along the way. Okay, to the chat. Which one of the tips, so these are the reminders of the tips, the 5 tips, which of the tips are tough? Which might be harder to do? Right? Maybe you're like, oh, the time's passed already, or like, oh, we're really regimented. Like, what from your perspective might be tough to do?
It depends so much on the situation, you know? Like sometimes you just might not be able to be flexible
Mhm,
depending on what the task is.
mhm,
Um,
mhm. Yeah, we're hearing that in the chat too. Flexibility at time can be difficult, especially when there's time constraints or different constraints around you. Um, Maybe someone needs something, so you can't be flexible with something else. That can be hard and can relate to the advocacy piece also. We have one that says supporting teams. Many minds have different, sometimes opposing needs. Absolutely, right? And individualized support sometimes is unrealistic depending on the team with whom you're working. Sometimes different folks might need different support than others. That's great. I can think that sometimes setting goals and visioning together can be tough, even just carving out time for that and really prioritizing it. And then how do you keep going back to it? And it's like, you want us to do this on top of the deliverables that you want us to do? I got 17 bathrooms to clean, or, the catering's going to come this way, or, my costumes at the, I've been really about theater and dance today. Costumes are going to come in. So all of those things, it can be tough. And I'm going to say a really cliche thing that, leadership is not easy. If it was, everyone would do it. More so empowering team members depends on the available schedule. Yeah, absolutely. Stephen, I think that's a great point. So, are there any that you could implement tomorrow? Are there any of these as you think about like expectations, affirmations, being flexible, maybe checking in about flexibility, supporting? Oh, yeah. I bet Misty, that's to the last one. Yeah. Um, yeah, what could you implement tomorrow? What are some low-hanging fruit that could immediately contribute to an effectiveness of the team or the people with whom you work in terms of, right? I'm seeing setting goals in the chat, even if it's internal goals for you or like sharing out your goals at the next like team meetup. We're ending the semester, so it might be a really good time as we're moving into the next academic year. That's great. What else? Guiding group process. Yeah. Maybe even taking a little bit more of a facilitative role. Showing support for your team. Give me those post-its, man. Give me a just nice Teams message. Man, I light up when I get a nice Teams message just out of the blue. Someone, he videoed a compliment to me and emailed it to me. And I will never forget that. Me and this person, we are not close necessarily. We don't work together very often. I will not forget that forever. And it was like the smallest thing. All right, y'all. You have been great. You've hung with me. Um, when difficulties arise, I want to address this, right? Because there are challenges with some of these. We talked a little bit about support resources in practice. I'm a firm believer that not only with practice, but also with feedback, that Debbie has it spot on. The context and situations of things are changing and shifting all the time. And I believe that we've talked in some of the workshops about the differences between leadership and management, and that it can be a Venn diagram, but sometimes the skills of manager are different than the skills of leader, right? In terms of that aspiration, inspiration, like moving folks towards. Leadership is not easy. And thinking about the practice and the flexibility to alter some of your skills, depending on if you are in a very specific strategic hierarchy structure, or if you are in a family structure, right? How could some of these be implemented in a roommate situation? How could, because you oftentimes need to be leading your peers if you're living with three random individuals that you found on Craigslist or whatever, right? So how are some of these things, how can we use these in different ways as well? So here's where we went today. We talked about power with and Dr. Brown and her team's research around power with versus power over. We talked about the 5 tips around guiding the group process, around encouraging feedback, around all of those tips that we talked about. And then we talked a little bit about support for you and for your team. This takes practice. It is not overnight. And I want to offer myself up that I would love to just talk through any of the situations that you have. I'm working on my coaching certification. And so I think that these conversations are really important to have. And I oftentimes, to be able to reach the most amount of people, these workshops are overly general and a bit obscure. And you're like, cool, but like how? And sometimes that takes talking through it or emailing through it. So I am here and ready and willing and able. There is my email address, the website that has the SHAPE initiatives. And then I'm going to put into the chat our attendance link so I can make sure that Bridge matches up with this. There it is. So make sure you click that before you go. I'm happy to stick around for some questions. I am going to say bye to our recording folks. Bye, recording.